Our speaker tonight is Theodora Light. She's a PhD student in history at the University of Georgia. Her research centers on Indigenous Florida, particularly how Indian slavery affected Florida in the wider South during the 16th and 17th centuries. She currently works as a graduate teaching assistant, but has experience in training in the field of public history. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, now I'll stop sharing and let you take it away.
Thanks, Jamie. Okay. God willing, this works. We good, Jamie? Is it doing what I want it to do, or is it doing the wrong thing?
So it looks like you're in presenter mode. So we'll just have to
stop share and do it again. And we will deal with my cat coming in and out as she wills. Okay.
Looks good.
Okay. Nope, I don't think that's gonna work. Right?
Okay.
Well, how did we just do this? And is it right?
Yes, for us. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now let me get rid of your faces over my notes. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you all for having me. As he said, my name is Theodora Light. I got my MA in history from the University of Georgia, and I'm currently in my second semester in the PhD program. So while I work with archaeology and have experience in archaeology and anthropology, I am primarily a historian. So this won't be as archaeology heavy as I'm sure some of your lectures have been. So first of all, I think today I'm going to talk a little bit about how the beginning of this project and what it has sort of evolved into. And a lot of the evolution of this project is in thanks to grants and funding that I've received, both from my department, as well as the Alliance for Weeden Island Archaeological Research and Education. So I wanted to quickly thank them. A lot of this story would not have come out without that research support. I presented part of this at the Southern Historical Association conference in November. And so since then, I've evolved the project a little bit and expanded on certain ideas that I think y'all will be interested in. So as I said, I thought we'd start with how my project how it started, and where it's gone from there. If we want to think about like, this is the acorn, and we'll get at least to a sapling. So it started really with this map. I came across it when I was doing research at the Archivo General de Indias, sort of looking for maps to correspond with some of the ideas that I was coming across that were just fleeting mentions, right? So when we study Indigenous Florida or Indigenous early colonial histories of any sort, we often have to go to sort of other sources of information in order to back up our ideas and our theories. So I found this map. In the broad sense, it's a fascinating artifact in and of itself. It is from 1721, and it's attributed to William Hamerton. It is currently held at the Yale libraries. So if anybody has interest, they have the resolution of their imagery is so high that you can really zoom into any part of this and see it so clearly. Now, a lot of this information from the map, that's in the map, probably came from a partnership between Hamerton and Colonel John Barnwell, otherwise known as Tuscarora Jack, right? So a lot of the Indigenous information is coming from someone who is famous for his participation in the Tuscarora Wars. But it provides pretty incredible detail. And among that detail, as I was sort of focusing in on Florida, right, where I'm interested, I noticed here, and I'm going to pull, I can get a little pin here so I can laser point. I noticed this section here that I've circled for you. And the caption here is Tokobaga Indians destroyed 1709. And so a couple things came to my mind, and first and foremost among them is that that's not where the Tokobaga are from. Like that's not their place. So was this like some mistake in the map? I had a lot of questions, right? What are they doing essentially in Appalachia, which is most of this region here? Like I said, and as y'all are probably familiar with, this is the area that's highlighted in the map, and these are the homelands of the Tokobaga. So what did I know about the Tokobaga? What have I learned about the Tokobaga? Around the time that Europeans invaded the peninsula of Florida, we have documentation of what they recorded life to be like, in addition to some archaeological work, though that has been spotty and not done very recently. So we sort of piece these things together from multiple sources. Archaeologists believe that around the Little Ice Age, the groups that surrounded Tampa Bay, safety harbor peoples, they likely reorganized into sort of larger kinship units that occupied longhouse style living arrangements. So this is something that's more familiar probably to people who study Iroquoian societies. But you'd have, perhaps 100 people who are all related. They have kinship ties, and we are not familiar enough. I don't think we know enough about what clan identity meant at this time. But groups living with inside like relational organization structure in these longhouse style accommodations all around the Tampa Bay area. Something very similar is happening at Colusa as well. And part of the reason for this is because, as the name connotes, the Little Ice Age was cold, sea level changed, and resources were sort of scarcer than they had been during the medieval warm period. So this required a lot more cooperation among groups in order to produce surpluses and survive, right? So more specifically to the sort of colonial period, when the Adelantado Pedro Menendez visits Tokobaga in 1568, the cacique, the head cacique at Tokobaga, is able to summon between 29 chiefs and over 100 nobles. So what does that tell us about the potential population at Tokobaga? Well, I don't know. It doesn't tell us a lot, but we could probably estimate that these subordinate chiefs probably represented a village of some size. And so if we estimate that it was between, somewhere between 250 and 500 people, or maybe 1,000 at the very most, probably living there in the capital, we get a rather large population estimate. And the Tokobaga are one of 4 groups that occupy the Tampa Bay area. But it appears from the records that Tokobaga is sort of what we would call the paramount chief. And so this population estimate, given that sort of very loosey-goosey math, historian, not a mathematician, gives us about between 10 and 15,000 people. That is a lot of people. If we consider the sort of Mississippian world that is coming to a decline, by the time Europeans are arriving in the Florida Peninsula, this would probably indicate that this is a complex or paramount chiefdom. Control, tributary responsibility is exercised over a fairly large territory. And the center of this is this paramount chief, right? It is a hierarchical society. It is a unilineal society. Most of the Southeast is matrilineal. There is an exception in Colusa, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But as I'm thinking about all the things that I know about Colusa, I start to come up with a question, right? So how did the Tokobaga end up in Appalachia, which is not where they're from? And how did they end up, destroyed? And I've put it in scare quotes because I will talk about that word in and of itself, by 1709, right? So, roughly 150 years after Pedro Menendez shows up and the Tokobaga head cacique can command, 29 chiefs and headmen to show up to this meeting that he's called. What other things in South Florida might be affecting the answer to this question, right? And so, of course, knowing what we know about Tokobaga, their principal rivalry is with the Colusa. So I briefly mentioned them earlier, only to say that they're patrilineal, not matrilineal, but the Colusa are widely considered the, preeminent Florida indigenous empire. The Spanish rarely confer the title of king on indigenous leaders, but it is conferred upon the Colusa leader, who they renamed Carlos. His name was Callus. I don't have any idea how to pronounce that, but the Spanish sort of Hispanicize his name into Carlos, and they refer to him as a king. Archaeologists estimate that in comparison with what was a fairly large complex or paramount chiefdom at Tokobaga, between 10 and 15,000 people, the Colusa king controlled up to 20,000 people, living in tributary communities across South Florida with some responsibility or another, whether that's to go to war on his command or to undertake sort of massive monumental construction and engineering projects. So on the left here, and I'll go back to my little printer, this sort of outlines the potential reach, the geographic reach of the Colusa tributary power. And then here on the bottom right is an artist's rendering of what the primary mound at the Colusa capital at Mound Key would have looked like. So there are several really important things to note about these construction projects. Number one, the scale of them is enormous. So here in Athens, we have Sanford Stadium. It holds 93,000 people. The amount of anthropomorphic materials and dirt and earth that would have to have been moved to construct this platform mound that you see here, as well as these engineering projects, and I'll talk about those in a second, that amount of just raw material would have filled Sanford Stadium, a stadium that is designed to fill 93,000 seats. It is a lot of stuff. One of the interesting components of this is that a lot of this is shellfish that they ate first, right? So it's hard to understate the enormity of this project. And this includes, as I'd mentioned, it's not just mounds. There are two mounds at Mound Key, the capital. There's another capital at Tampa, but in Pineland today. But it doesn't just include these mounds, which are massive. It also includes substantial aquatic engineering projects. So you have this huge canal that bisects between these two mounds. But in addition to the canal, you have down here, and I realize it might be hard to see because the image is small, but these are water courts. And archaeologists speculate that they were used for fish capture, right? So tide would come in and nets would be put up. And then when the tide went out, the fish are trapped. This all underscores that rather than a typical Mississippian chiefdom that is characterized, it's beaten into your head. It's maize agriculture, maize agriculture, maize agriculture. At Colusa and in some of these other South Florida polities, they are reliant on aquaculture. So they are getting their primary sources of food from the water. They're also hunting and gathering, but most of what they're engaging with is coming from these salt marsh estuaries that are incredibly ecologically productive. Even during the Little Ice Age, these are some of the most ecologically rich environments in the world. So here's Colusa, this enormous polity of great geopolitical strength. And when Pedro Menendez arrives in Colusa, he goes to Colusa first. He's on his sort of trip around Florida. And the Colusa king, one of the first comments that he makes to him is that he would like Menendez to ally with him in war against Tokobaga. So it's revealed to us that, there is some deep existing rivalry between these two fairly powerful, one of them fairly powerful and one of them tremendously powerful societies. Now, that's not all of the sort of context that we're dealing with in South Florida, because in addition to this pre-existing inter-indigenous conflict, Tampa Bay is going to be visited by multiple Spanish voyages in the sort of early to mid period of the 16th century. Panfilo de Narvaez in 1528, and about 20 years later, or 10 years later, excuse me, the most famous or infamous probably invasion of Hernando de Soto and his entrada, his giant trapeze through the southeast. And so I recognize that this map is maybe not as clear as I think it is, but it's identifying the origin of these groups out from the Caribbean and into Tampa Bay, which is right here. It's also visited by Fray Luis Cancer, who does not, his voyage ends in total death. So Narvaez, there's at least 3 people that survive, and De Soto, there are a handful, right? The Cancer expedition is totally wiped out in Tampa Bay. And so by the time Menendez visits in 1568, Tampa has seen repeated invasions almost on a 10-year basis. And the early incentive to visit North America from the Caribbean, if we're talking about the center of Spanish power, the regional center of Spanish power, one of the focuses of these early expeditions that also include Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón and the first by Juan Ponce de Leon, these are for taking Indian slaves. Whether it is the earliest voyages here, which are sort of reconnaissance missions where they would capture as many as they could and take them back to the Caribbean, or these later voyages. De Soto just goes from town to town taking slaves that included, the headmen and headwomen of these polities. So, adding all of this together, we get a sort of depiction of this Mississippian or Mississippian adjacent world. So most people do not characterize Florida south of Appalachia as Mississippian, largely because of the maize agriculture. But the rest of this world, north here in the continental southeast, is devastated by particularly De Soto's entrada. It doesn't hurt to emphasize again the effect of European diseases. I'm sure you've heard it over and over and over again, but everywhere they went, they are spreading disease. And not just European diseases. You have to imagine that communities that are not linked concretely or constantly, just taking people from one community to another can introduce different diseases, and a lot of trade. So even though the Mississippian world is characterized as increasing conflict around growing scarcer resources because of the Little Ice Age, archaeologists and I haven't gotten a good answer to this question. Why? Archaeologists realize that even though there's all this competition, there's a fluorescence of trade across the Southeast. And so traders are moving between communities, they're spreading disease, they're spreading conflict, and Robbie Etheridge and others have sort of characterized what we call the Mississippian shatter zone. So, trade, disease, warfare, and slavery are these kind of interrelated themes in the Mississippian world. And they predate Europeans. So, imagining those four ideas would make a pretty unstable universe. That instability before Europeans arrive is functional, right? So you have the rise and fall of certain groups, you have mound sites that are occupied, abandoned, and occupied again, and this sort of fracturing and coalescence of what we'd probably inappropriately call like modern conceptions of groups, right? So Etheridge's study was on the transition from the Chickasaw, I don't really know how to say it, to the Chickasaw, which is something that we could recognize today, right? When Europeans arrive, they're increasing this instability in a way that makes it no longer functional, and groups are falling off the record, showing up in different places, a shattering across this area. So it is not just the Mississippian world, which may or may not include Florida, right? It's important to think about the beginnings of colonization beginning in the Caribbean when we're thinking about Florida, right? It's just Cuba's 90 miles away. The Bahamas are right there. And so Aaron Woodruff Stone published a book 2 years ago that sort of took this anthropological framework developed by Etheridge and others and applied this shatter zone theorization into the Caribbean. And sort of centrally to this, and you can see in this map, is the expansion of the Indian slave trade as populations are just literally dying in droves. The Spanish are reaching further and further afield. And part of this is because of the intricacies of Spanish law that eventually say, well, you can't enslave Indians, they're our subjects. And the Spanish will just say, well, if we go a little further out, they're not our subjects, so we can enslave them, right? Or if they're cannibals, we can enslave them. Or if they're already enslaved by other indigenous people, we can buy those slaves, right? But by the early 1500s, this area is is irreparably changed by these effects. And what we start to see is something that my advisor commented is shrapnel. So people who are being flung from their places of origin across the region, right? And by the 1500s, by the early 1500s, some of these people are winding up among the Colusa. So we don't know a ton about this group of people, but we do know a little from the memorial of Hernando de Fontaneda, who as a child was shipwrecked on the Florida coast. And in 1575, he wrote this sort of description of Florida. And in this description, he talking about Colusa, he mentions that there are Cuban Indians who came in search of the Fountain of Youth. I don't think that's true. But the king at the time, Carlos's father, allowed them to settle within Colusa, and it appears that they lived somewhat autonomously, but under the control of the Colusa king, right? I did not mean to do that. We just skipped right ahead. Apologies. So to me, and I've posed this question here, as I was doing more research and digging deeper and deeper, the things that I was finding that might explain why Tokobaga people are not living at their home, they've moved to Appalachia and they're living in smaller groups. A theory that might explain this is maronnage, right? Are these maroons? So what is Maronnage, right? I dug into the historiography. One interesting thing that I found is that, there are all these incredible books about Maroon communities, but there's very little there's not one definition of what is a Maroon and what is a Maroon community. There are several characteristics, right? So it's principally applied to these self-emancipated communities of African origin. However, they're often, if not always, relying on some degree of cooperation from Indigenous people who are local to the area. Part of just knowing the terrain, which is usually in these hinterlands or borderland areas where territorial control becomes a little blurred. They're relying on collaboration, but not just with Amerindians. They're also, to a degree, still part of the colonial system that is sort of characterized by slavery. Slavery doesn't exist without resistance to it. So, Richard Price, who is sort of the big figure in Maroon literature, said that successful Maroon communities worked out fairly extensive economic relations with colonial societies and harnessed a surprising amount of collusion by members of almost all social classes, right? So they're leveraging economic or political or military might in order to, get concessions. This is what we see most often across the Caribbean, probably most famously in Jamaica. They are going to be politically recognized and can be hired out, or their territory cannot be infringed. So a lot of these characteristics that I'm reading about African Maroon communities, they seem to really correlate with what might be these instances of Indigenous people fleeing enslavement themselves. And so I am a historian, so I went to the documentary record. And sure enough, I knew that the term Maroon itself came from a Spanish word, cimarron. And the first applications of the term cimarron in the Americas and the Caribbean is about Spanish livestock that are running away and becoming wild. So as insulting as that is, the origin of the word, that is what it is. It is very quickly applied not to self-emancipating enslaved people of African origin, but to Indigenous communities. So the Spanish fairly quickly, especially in the Caribbean, start trying to organize Indigenous life in a separation between what they call Indios Bravos or Cimarrones and Indios Mansos, which essentially domesticated. And those domesticated, these Christianized, docile Indigenous people should have a level of autonomy and protection of the Spanish crown in these pueblos de Indios that are literally Indian villages, right? European people cannot live in them. They are controlled by a local leader, though the Spanish crown can exercise some level of control as well. But the primary purpose in this documentary record is to separate these Maroon Indians, the bad, dangerous ones, from the good Indians, right? And so just to give you an example, a lot of this is happening in the 1530s and 1540s, especially when Hernando de Soto is governor of Cuba. So there's a lot of records, accessible records for that period. And there's a whole series of sort of, these are documents from a series of justicia. So they're legal records to a degree. And, you see the application in this particular example that they're applying resources to combat the regiment of Maroon Indians, right? These bad, dangerous, unchristianized, heathen, and autonomous groups that are popping up in direct relation to abuses. So these documents are filled with acknowledgments by Spanish authorities that these people are running away because they are dying in droves and they're being worked to death. Right, to me, that sounds very much like Maronnage. And indeed, that is literally the term that they use. So why am I telling you all this, right? We're going to take this back to Appalachia and Tokobaga people living in Appalachia, because indeed they did live in Appalachia, and people have commented on this. So the map on the left is essentially, you can see up here is where it is in Florida. It's right at the crux of the curve of the panhandle. And this is Appalachia territory. And John Hahn, in his book on Appalachia, did identify several Tokobaga settlements. There's not just one. There are multiple sort of independent settlements of Tokobaga people. And where he's getting this information is from a 1678 visita by Domingo de la Turriando. And that part of it is here on the right. And as he's crossing Florida, he comes across this, settlement of what he titles as Tokobagas infieles, or, literally infidel Tokobagas, who are living autonomously. They have a sort of economic role in the community itself. They're serving as river transport that the Spanish themselves use, right? So if we're talking about those economic ties that Maroon communities are able to leverage. A perfect example, they are unconverted. They are not Christians, right? And the reason that this is important is by the second quarter of the 1600s, Appalachia is missionized. This is a Christian community. And even when the Appalachia flee into French Louisiana, they are noted for their devout Catholicism, right? They want, vestments, they want all the things for their church. And so it's weird that you've got this group of people who do not follow their religion. It does, however, come across in the documents that they might have had some kind of relationship with the cacique of Ivatachuco, who was one of the two ruling leaders of Appalachia. And for the purposes of this, I don't think getting into that is super important. It is also clear in these documents that the Tokobaga who are living here have a sort of strange relationship with Christianity. They are aware, obviously, and at some point they tell Leturiando that 20 people in their community had died at some point. They wanted a Christian burial, so they were baptized. And this cacique of Ivatachuco allowed them to be buried in their Doctrina church, which is a big deal. Doctrina churches had mass every day. If you were Christian, this is where you wanted to be buried. So no matter what I can find from these documents, why they're not Christian, why they wanted to be Christian, relationship with the cacique there, there's no discussion of how they ended up here. Why are they there? So there's just no 100% answer, but I think it would be plausible to suggest that the displacement of these groups, and they seem to correspond with what that sort of longhouse style of living that would have had groups of 100, 200 people who had, kin relationships, that they're just picking up and leaving Tokobaga and relocating as a larger kinship unit. And I would, suggest that the reason that they're doing this is because Florida is becoming increasingly unstable. Colusa has allied with the Spanish, at least temporarily, and the spread of disease and conflict and enslavement is something that, in a world where people do know what's happening nearby, it had to be terrifying, just the uncertainty of it all, the danger of it all. So this sort of uncertain, horrible world to live in might have encouraged people to say, you know what, we're going to go somewhere else, and maybe seek the protection of a powerful cacique, and attempt to leverage our economic viability or whatever, our kin ties going back hundreds of years, trade relationships, to live somewhere safer. I would suggest then that what they're doing, seeking protection from a world pervaded by notions of enslavement, changing notions of enslavement, that the term maroon works for this, for what's happening here. I would also suggest that indigenous maronnage like this has existed in South Florida since those first reports at Colusa, in the first years of the 1500s, and that it likely existed across the peninsula and the wider Southeast. So what have we talked about? What information have I dumped on you? We talked about how this project came to be, looking at that map, developing a research question, and then we've talked about who the Tokobaga are. Why is it weird that they're in Appalachia? What is their relationship to the other prominent indigenous kingdom in South Florida? And how do these themes relate to Florida being positioned in this sort of convergence of two, devastating shatter zones that are, totally altering indigenous life in the Southeast? And my position that what it is doing is creating maroon communities that are solely indigenous, at least, maybe probably solely indigenous, across Florida and across the Southeast. So that's most of the story, and I'm going to just really quickly go through the rest of this because I do want to save time for questions. But of course, Florida is not only affected by the Caribbean, but powerfully impacted by colonization of Carolina and this sort of devastating Indian slave trade that develops there. Years, I don't remember when this book was published, but Alan Galley's Bancroft book, he posited that this slave trade enslaved between 30 and 50,000 people, indigenous people, who were either captured directly by the British or by Native Americans for sale to the British, often to pay off these sort of unruly debts that traders are imposing on them. And so this figure between 30 and 50,000, that's just before 1715 at the outbreak of the Yamasee War. And so, trading, even if it's slave trading, again, you're, spreading disease. Those communities are spreading disease. It's causing incredible conflict. And one of the primary targets of slave raids are these missions in North Florida. And so further than just this, what I've targeted for our talk as something that, sparked my interest, if you read closely, and again, the map on the Yale website is very, very clear. You can see, at least here, where it's identified Timucua, it says wholly laid waste, being destroyed by the Carolinians, 1706, right? And so these slave raids are impinging on a world that has been heavily missionized, decimated by disease for almost 150 years. And the sort of coup de grace considered this series of raids perpetrated by James Moore, a Carolinian, with his Yamasee and Creek allies. And that is going to be the pretty much the end of the North Florida mission chains that had been populated by tens of thousands of people. And so when we ask this question, okay, what does it mean destroyed? What happened to them? The context here is that they've already been displaced from the area that they're from by an increasing regional instability, right? And they've relocated in groups as maroon communities in Appalachia. Appalachia, as well as Timucua and Guale, are already porous. These places have been subject to disease, conflict, a dozen rebellions, and increasing sort of clamping down on tribute requirements from the Spanish, from their capital at St. Augustine. And so once you add in this slave raiding that starts at the end of the 1600s, this area is already so loose and horrific. It's bad things have been happening there for 150 years, right? And so by the time the Yamasee War happens between 1715 and 1717, and that's a whole nother talk in and of itself, all this conflict is just building and building and building. And central to the conflict itself is the pervasive nature of Indian slavery and its, sort of region-wide effects. As to the last question, what does destroyed mean? I don't think all Tokobagas were wiped off the face of the earth, right? That's the issue that we have with this sort of wholly laid waste or destroyed, right? It indicates that there's no cultural continuity, there's no survival. And so historians and archaeologists have found evidence that Tokobagas indeed packed up and moved with the Appalachia, who went and relocated into French Louisiana, and the San Luis de Talimali Indians are still there today, right? In addition to that, historians have also speculated that from the record, it appears that some of them moved closer to the seat of Spanish authority at St. Augustine. However, it's very hard to figure out what happened to them afterwards. My understanding of what's going on in English Carolina and these devastating slave raids, you have a governor of Florida in 1708 who's saying they took 10,000 people. Of course, I doubt they took 10,000 people, but you do have tens of thousands of people enslaved. And I figured, some of them have got to be in Carolina. And indeed, this is a report to the Commissioners of Indian Trade in Carolina. And it indicates that there are enslaved Tokobaga living, probably Santalina Indian is not, there are no Santalinas. So I'm assuming what this meant is that around St. Helena in South Carolina. That's all I have. I tried to rush through that last part, but I know we have like 12 minutes left for questions, comments, concerns, and of course, thank you all. I really appreciate the time. Stop sharing, I think, right? Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Theodora. A very interesting talk and very important. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can, I find it's easiest to type them in the chat, but if you prefer to, unmute yourself and ask them, go ahead. I did just get a question for you. Okay, from Anna Gingrich. She would like to know, has anyone else applied the term Maroons to talk about Indigenous refugee communities before, as opposed to African descent?
Right. So when I first started this, I found that in this anthology, Richard Price's edited volume on Maroon societies, there is mention of this sort of idea of an Indigenous Maronnage, right? Communities that are fleeing enslavement. This is where the term comes from. But I think this sort of fell out. I got the impression from folks that attended the SHA panel that are Caribbeanists, they're Latin Americanists, or they work in Florida, that this has been met with unpleasantness, that it was not sort of accepted. So that is an answer. It has been applied before. I'm not the first person to think this, of course.
Okay, thank you. And she also had a second part to the question. She was wondering how widespread the distinction was between Indios Bravos and Indios Mansos.
So far my research has only been in Cuba. right? Those documents, especially from the governorship of Hernando de Soto, are much more accessible than others. But that is one area that I intend to continue research this summer. I've applied for some research funding to look particularly at that. I'd also like to sort of get a more satisfying conclusion to the Tokobaga story in particular. But I can tell you that between the 1530s and 1550s in Cuba, it is a fairly widespread distinction, particularly for like legal purposes of establishing pueblos de indios, right? They have to have these safe villages. One of these is at Guanabacoa, who Jane Landers has worked, this community has worked on for quite a while. Guanabacoa, when they're talking about establishing this sort of safe haven, they're using those very specific terms. They have to be protected from these indios bravos, so indios cimarrones. And my translation of mansos is probably, there could be a better word. I'm not sure. I've never heard it applied.
Okay, thank you for that answer, and thank you for the question, Anna. Anyone else have any questions?
Trying to pound some water. That was a lot to get out.
Yeah, great job.
Thank you.
Well, my advisor, Tom Pecan, wrapped up excavations at Safety Harbor, so that work may help kind of contextualize.
I'm really looking forward to it. There's also some interesting work being done on sort of the pre-Spanish trade relationships between Tampa Bay and Appalachia, which might sort of lend insight on why they chose Appalachia. So I'm looking forward to stuff being published, right? I have to wait until things are published.
Absolutely. Cool. All right, well, it's looking like there's no more questions for you, so I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. And I just want to say thank you again so much for, spending your time with us and sharing your important research to us.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, monthly or yearly.
Yeah, I'll be glad when you go on.
I don't know what's going
Yeah,
on.
Oh, well, I don't want him too young right now.
okay. Sorry.
I'm reaching out to Anna really quick, so I don't want you to end the Zoom. So I'd love to provide my email for everyone if you
Quiet
have
for a
any
minute,
questions
because I'm
that
going
you'd
to
like.
speak.
Okay.
Okay. You have a question?
There might have been a question, but Zoom, we're not as good at it as we should be by now.
Right.
Or at least I'm not. All right, let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yay, I don't have a question. I just wanted to say this is my first time on this site, and I'm interested in archaeology kinds of things. And a friend of mine, Brent, introduced me to this site tonight. And I just want to say it's been very interesting listening to your talk on Florida and the indigenous people and the Indians and how they moved about. I just want to tell you, it's very interesting for me. And I'll be a regular member of this site with some valuable questions in the future. So thank you.
Oh, well, I'm very flattered. Thank you. I'm glad I was your first talk and it brought you in. Seems like a win for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. We're looking forward to having you in the future too. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to put my email in the chat. And if anybody has questions that they didn't want to, pop out and say, you are welcome to email me and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Okay, there we go. Again, I really appreciate everybody's time. and maybe we'll do this again sometime. I'd love to go to a brewery in Tampa.
Absolutely, anytime. Yeah. Yeah, they're a
Right.
great venue for talks and also for not talks. So
Yeah. I have my aunt and uncle live in Tampa, and then I have family in Clearwater as well. So I like getting down there as much as I can.
cool. Have you been
Yeah.
to Safety Harbor?
Yes, but only very cursory because
Uh-huh.
my husband doesn't, that's not something that he loves to do. But we did find the what is the name of that? Ulele, the restaurant.
Yeah.
And that was a wild experience.
Yeah, they've got some great food.
They do have good food.
The legend of Ulele is interesting.
It's I'll just spoiler alert, it's not right.
Right.
All right, well, thank you again. I'm gonna sign off. Again, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk. Set up Zoom or whatever for anybody that has questions. And thank you again. I'm gonna go.
Thank you. Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
take care. Bye.